Let's dive into something we don't talk about enough, and that's age discrimination, especially in the workplace.
Yeah.
We had a request to unpack some excerpts from Navigating Age Discrimination in the Workplace and Beyond. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And we really want to make this practical. So this isn't just about the law.
Yeah.
It's about how to recognize when this is happening. And importantly, what can you do about it?
I think it's interesting because we often think of discrimination as these like very overt acts.
Right.
But age discrimination can be really subtle and,
Yeah.
and really insidious. So the author of this book talks about hitting this point in their career, and they kind of expected things to, get easier. And suddenly they're seeing fewer opportunities and they're seeing less interest. And they kind of start thinking, is this because I'm getting older?
Yeah. I can see that. That would be a really frustrating feeling, like you're hitting this wall.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this wasn't just like a one-time thing. It was like,
Right. They start talking to colleagues and they're hearing similar stories and they're realizing this is like this is a bigger systemic issue.
yeah, it's like this silent thing. But
Right.
I mean, before we get too far into this, we want to acknowledge LOCUM Integration, who make this deep dive possible.
Yes.
And their whole mission really revolves around supporting seasoned professionals.
Yeah.
So this topic really dovetails nicely with what they do. But back to those, subtle ways that age discrimination can show up.
Right.
The source material really emphasizes that it's not always blatant. It can be almost like whispers.
It is. It's, the silences, the like kind of flimsy excuses, the
Yeah.
dismissals. You just start to wonder, was that because of my age?
Yeah.
And it very well could be.
So how do we even figure that out? Like, what are some of the things we're looking for?
So the source breaks it down into kind of a few key areas.
Okay.
The first is what they call disparate treatment, which is when an older worker is treated differently than a younger worker in a similar situation. So this could be in terms of, hiring, promotions, even like salary discrepancies for the same role.
Yeah. Well, what would that look like? Do you have an example of like how that might actually play out?
Sure. So like a company choosing a younger, less experienced candidate over an older one with a proven track record for a leadership position.
Right.
Maybe the justification's vague.
Right.
But it leaves that older worker with this nagging feeling like, was I passed over because of my age? But without clear evidence, it's hard to prove.
Yeah, that would be demoralizing, really.
Yeah.
There's also disparate impact that they talk about.
Right. And that's more about policies that kind of appear neutral, but they actually end up disproportionately impacting older workers. So the classic example is like a job that requires heavy lifting.
Yeah.
While it's relevant for certain jobs, it might be used to kind of subtly weed out older applicants, regardless of their actual physical abilities.
Right. Right. Yeah, because that, that could be just a way to, like you said, weed people out without being obvious about it.
Right, right.
And then the hostile work environment, which is pretty self-explanatory, I guess.
Well, this is where, age-related jokes and insults,
right.
or maybe excluding older employees from, key events or decisions.
Yeah.
It just creates this really toxic environment.
Yeah.
Imagine, like, constantly being told that you're, like, over the hill.
Right.
Or being left out of, like, networking opportunities that younger colleagues are invited to.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would,
It can really chip away at someone's confidence.
Yeah. And I like how the source even mentioned that age discrimination can show up before you even get to the interview.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, your resume itself can reveal your age.
Right.
And then lead to bias before anyone's even met you.
Yeah.
So unreturned calls.
Right.
Radio silence from recruiters after you submit a stellar application. That can be a red flag, too. Yeah. I mean, how many people are getting just screamed out, because of their age? And,
right.
And that's a loss for companies, really.
Absolutely. And this is why, these conversations are so important.
Right.
If we start to understand how this operates, even in these subtle ways,
yeah,
we're better equipped to recognize it and call it out.
I love that. Knowledge is power. So let's get to some specific examples of how this can show up in the workplace.
Okay.
The source material had a whole section on the Civil Rights Act of 1990.
Okay.
And it was full of, like, really specific scenarios.
Yeah.
Did any of those jump out at you as, like, oh, yeah, I've seen that?
One of the things that I thought was really interesting was this idea of coded language. So seemingly harmless phrases that actually perpetuate age stereotypes.
Right.
So you'll hear things like, they talk about the younger employees as fresh faces.
Right.
and the older workers are set in their ways, for
Yeah.
example. It's subtle, but it sends a clear message about who's valued and who's not.
Yeah. It's like a dog whistle almost, you know?
Yes.
It seems harmless, but
Right.
the source also talks about things like, unequal access to training opportunities or
Yes.
promotions or like, those really interesting projects that can help
Right.
your career. I think this is where it probably gets, most evident.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. If younger colleagues are consistently getting the development opportunities
Right.
and the older workers are kind of stuck in a rut, that's a major red flag.
Right. Yeah. And it's not just opportunities, but it's like assumptions about older workers
Oh, yeah. Oh,
too.
absolutely.
Like they can't keep up with the technology or they don't
Yeah.
have the energy, like all that stuff.
Right. They lack the drive.
Right.
That's a classic stereotype.
Yeah.
It's just not true. I mean, so many older workers are incredibly tech savvy,
Yeah.
and they bring this wealth of knowledge and experience
Right.
that companies would be foolish to overlook.
Right. And they've seen a lot. They know how to handle
Right.
difficult situations. And yeah, but as you said, they get overshadowed by those,
Absolutely.
stereotypes.
Yeah.
It's like judging a book by its cover.
It is.
And then there's also the, the social exclusion.
Right.
So you think about like after work events or team building things
Right.
that often lead to, connections that are helpful for your career.
Absolutely.
If older workers are consistently left out of that,
Right.
that can really hurt their career.
It can. Yeah, it's almost like they're being subtly pushed to the sidelines,
Right.
both professionally and socially.
Yeah.
It could be really isolating.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the issue of suspicious layoffs,
Right.
which the source mentions. Companies might target older workers or, their specific job roles
Yeah.
and try to disguise it as like restructuring or downsizing.
Right.
And while those things can happen for legitimate reasons, it's good to be aware of the potential age bias there.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
If you see a pattern of older workers being disproportionately affected by layoffs, it's a huge red flag.
Yeah, it's all about connecting the dots.
Mm.
And then they mentioned a 2009 Supreme Court ruling
Yes.
that made it even tougher for older workers to actually prove age discrimination in court.
Right. This ruling essentially raised the bar for evidence, and it required older workers to demonstrate that age was like the decisive factor in a negative action.
So it's not enough to show that age played a role. It has to be like the reason.
It has to be the primary reason.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that can be incredibly difficult to prove.
Yeah. I can see how that would be really hard.
Especially when discrimination is veiled and employers, I mean, let's face it, they're good at coming up with alternate explanations for their actions.
Yeah. It really, it's like they've,
Right.
got all their ducks in a row. And it is disheartening to think that this kind of bias is so, baked into our systems. But even with these legal hurdles, we want to, keep perspective here because age discrimination is a real problem. And, the statistics paint a pretty clear picture of how prevalent it is.
Absolutely.
And you cited some really concerning numbers from AARP and the EEOC. Did you know that 2 out of 3 workers
Wow.
over 50
That's a lot.
report facing age discrimination in the workplace? That's huge.
It is a staggering number.
And it really, I think that highlights how much we need to be talking about this.
Absolutely.
And they also said that many people believe that age discrimination starts as early as your 50s.
Yeah, that's younger than I would expect it.
Yeah. It's almost like, once you hit that point, it's just assumed that you're
Right.
over the hill or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
And less valuable.
Yeah, it's a harmful assumption. I mean, older workers, they bring so much to the table. They've got the experience, the wisdom, a strong work ethic, and often a greater sense of loyalty to their employers.
Yeah. And I've even read that they tend to be more engaged and they have lower turnover rates,
Right.
which is valuable for companies.
That's it.
Yeah. And it's a shame that these positive attributes are often ignored because of stereotypes.
They are. And it's costing companies valuable talent and expertise.
Yeah. So before we get into, how we can change that narrative and what you can do if you're facing this kind of discrimination, let's hear more about LOCUM integration
Okay.
and the work they're doing to address these very challenges.
Sounds good.
We're back. And before we went to LOCUM integration, we were looking at some statistics about age discrimination and how common it is. But the source also pointed out that there's a gender gap in how people perceive this issue.
Yeah. Studies have shown that women are actually significantly more likely to report either experiencing or witnessing age discrimination compared to men.
Interesting.
And there are a few theories about why this might be. It could have to do with societal expectations around aging and how women are treated differently in the workplace as they get older.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's like a double standard going on,
It's certainly possible.
where women face even more hurdles
Right.
as they age.
And it's an area that definitely deserves more research. But regardless of the reason,
Yeah.
it's clear that age discrimination impacts men and women.
Right.
So we need solutions that take everyone's experiences into account.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. What can someone actually do if they believe they're experiencing this?
Well, the source really emphasizes documentation as a crucial first step.
Okay.
So keep detailed records of anything that seems like age discrimination. Dates, times, who was involved, specific details of what happened.
So that's like building a case file almost.
Exactly. And this paper trail is essential if you decide to pursue legal action.
Okay, and speaking of legal action, the source also recommends that you consult with an employment lawyer who specializes in age discrimination.
Yes,
And they can help you kind of assess, like,
Right.
do I have a case?
Right. They can help you understand your rights,
Right?
see if you have a strong case, and also just navigate that really complex legal process.
Right, because that's not something
Yeah.
you want to do on your own.
No.
Are there any options for, like, addressing it within the company before, resorting to a lawsuit?
Yeah, a lot of companies have internal grievance procedures
Right.
for reporting discrimination or harassment.
Okay.
And it's definitely worth exploring those options first
Mm-hmm.
because they can sometimes lead to a resolution
Yeah.
without having to involve the courts.
So going through the proper channels and hoping that you'll find someone who takes it seriously.
Exactly, yeah.
And even if that doesn't, result in the outcome you want, I guess having that documentation shows that you tried to go through the proper channels
Right,
before
yeah.
you...
Exactly. It strengthens your case.
take it further.
Right.
It's like your due diligence.
Absolutely.
So you've done everything you can. And even if you don't end up taking legal action,
Right.
it can help to raise awareness within the company.
Absolutely.
So maybe it protects other people.
It can. Yeah, it's about speaking truth to power, even if it's just within your own organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but beyond those legal battles and things like that, how do we change the narrative around age and work in general?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the source really highlights the need to focus on the positive attributes that older workers bring. We need to challenge these outdated notions that age equals decline.
Right.
And instead, really showcase the unique skills and knowledge and perspectives they offer.
It's like flipping the script almost. So instead of what they lack,
Right.
it's what they
What they bring.
And the data supports this, right?
It does. Research consistently shows that older workers are often more engaged. They have lower turnover rates. They bring a wealth of experience that companies can benefit from in countless ways.
Yeah. So it's not just about being nice to older workers. It's recognizing that they have value.
Yes, they're assets.
Yes. But as you said earlier, this is going to take a multifaceted approach.
Right.
So what else needs to happen?
Well, one key area is policy reform.
Okay.
We need stronger legal protections for older workers
Yeah.
at both the federal and state levels.
Okay.
The source points out that the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the ADEA, while it was a landmark piece of legislation, it does have some limitations.
Right. We talked about that a little bit.
Right.
What are some of the challenges with it?
Well, it was passed in 1967, which, at the time was a great step in the right direction. But over time, court rulings have made it harder to actually prove age discrimination. And it doesn't always protect federal employees from being treated unfairly
Right.
based on their age. And a good example of that is the Babb v. Wilkie case in 2020.
Okay.
It just highlighted how even if age wasn't the only reason for the action, it still could have been a factor.
Okay.
And the law doesn't always protect against that.
So it needs to be clarified and strengthened a bit.
Absolutely.
So what else needs to change?
Well, alongside policy changes, we also need a culture shift within organizations.
Yeah.
And this starts with leadership.
Okay.
Companies need to make a conscious effort to create inclusive workplaces
Yeah.
that value all forms of diversity.
Yeah. So not just saying it, but
Right.
actually doing it.
Absolutely. So that means actually implementing policies and practices
Okay.
that promote age equity at every level.
Right.
So from recruitment and hiring to training and development to promotion and compensation.
To baking it in.
Yes, it's about creating that culture
Yes.
where experience is valued and not dismissed.
Right. Yeah. And that's a long game,
It is.
I think. So in the meantime, what can individuals do to support older workers?
Well, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Individual actions matter too.
Yeah.
We could all be allies to older workers, both in our workplaces and in our communities.
What does that look like?
Well, it means speaking up when we see ageism happening,
Hmm.
challenging stereotypes,
Okay.
advocating for policies that promote age equity.
Okay.
And we can also support organizations that are actively creating opportunities for older workers and dismantling ageist barriers.
Right. Like locum integration.
Exactly, like LOCUM integration.
So putting our money where our mouth is and supporting companies that are making an effort.
Absolutely.
And now back to locum integration, because they've been doing some fascinating research into this,
Yes,
specifically within different sectors of the job market.
they have. They've been focusing on the recruiting, staffing, and consultancy sectors in North America,
Okay.
which are known for their competitive and often youth-centric cultures.
Right.
So it's a really important area to focus on.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a, kind
Yeah.
of a breeding ground for this.
Right. And one of their most interesting discoveries came from analyzing job postings.
Mm.
And they found that certain phrases were consistently used in roles that were less likely to be filled by older candidates.
Oh, so this goes back to that coded language thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Things like digital native,
Right.
recent graduate,
Yeah.
even fast-paced environment often served as these subtle cues that older workers need not apply.
Yeah, it's like a secret code that you have to know how to decipher.
It is. And these subtle cues can have a huge impact on who gets considered for a role.
Right.
And then they interviewed recruiters and hiring managers.
Okay.
And what they found was really eye-opening. Many admitted that age was often a factor in their decision-making,
Mm.
even if they weren't consciously aware of it.
So like unconscious bias.
Exactly. So they might have assumptions about older workers' tech skills,
Right.
their adaptability to
Right.
new ways of working,
Yeah.
even their salary expectations.
Right.
And these assumptions, even if they're not explicitly stated,
Right.
can influence who gets invited for an interview and ultimately who gets hired.
It's like this filter
It is.
that you're not even aware of.
Right.
And it's weeding out people who might be qualified.
Absolutely. And some recruiters and hiring managers even expressed a preference for younger workers,
Mm.
citing their perceived energy and enthusiasm and willingness to work long hours.
Right, like the stereotype of the millennial
Right.
who's willing to, burn the candle at both ends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it creates this false dichotomy between young and hungry versus like old and out of touch.
Right.
And in reality, older workers often bring a level of dedication and a work ethic
Yeah.
and institutional knowledge that younger workers just haven't had time to develop yet.
Yeah, for sure. So what else did they find in terms of like the hiring process?
Well, they found that these subtle forms of discrimination can also emerge during the interview process itself.
Okay.
So interviewers might ask older candidates questions
Okay.
that subtly challenge their relevance or their ability to keep up with the latest trends.
Like what?
So think about things like, how comfortable are you with TikTok?
Right.
Or questions about their retirement plans or willingness to relocate.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're kind of looking for reasons not to hire them
Right.
based on ageist assumptions.
Yeah. And I guess it's hard to,
I go,
recognize those in the moment and be like,
right, it can be hard to pinpoint.
hey, what are you doing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just this feeling that something's off.
Right. And it highlights the need for greater awareness and education,
Yeah.
not just among employers, but among job seekers as well.
Yeah, so they can advocate for themselves.
Absolutely.
So we're trying to do that here with this deep dive.
Exactly.
Is bring that awareness. Yes, shining a light on this often hidden world of age discrimination.
Right. But there's a whole other part to this.
Yes.
Like, what can we do systematically to change things?
Right, there's a whole ecosystem of solutions that need to be explored.
So let's dig into that and explore what it takes to create a world where age is not a barrier to opportunity.
Okay, so let's dive into those systemic solutions. It's clear that we need more than just, individual good intentions.
Right. We have to address like the underlying biases and the structural issues that allow age discrimination to thrive.
Yeah. Where do we even begin with something this complex?
Well, policy reform is crucial. Stronger laws to protect older workers.
Mm-hmm.
And that means at both the federal and the state level.
Okay.
We've talked about the ADEA and some of its limitations, and those loopholes really need to be closed.
Yeah. So it's got to have some teeth to it.
It does. And then enforcement is key as well. We need agencies like the EEOC
Right.
to have the resources and authority to investigate these claims.
And hold employers accountable.
It's one thing to have the law, but then if it's not being enforced, it doesn't do much good.
Exactly.
So policy is one piece of it. We also talked about the need for like a culture shift within organizations.
Right.
How do we create that kind of systemic change?
It starts at the top.
Yeah.
Company leadership has to prioritize creating inclusive workplaces.
Right.
And that includes age diversity.
So walking the walk,
Yeah.
not just talking the talk.
Exactly. So that means actually implementing policies
Right.
and practices that promote age equity
Okay.
at every level.
What does that actually look like, though?
So that's everything from recruitment and hiring to training and development,
Right.
to promotion to compensation.
So really, like, weaving it into the DNA of the company.
Exactly. It's about creating that environment where experience is seen as an asset, not a liability.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's going to take a while.
It will.
So while we're working towards that, what can we do in the meantime to support older workers?
Well, this is where individual allyship comes in.
Okay.
When we see ageism, we have to call it out,
Yeah.
challenge the stereotypes.
Mm.
We can advocate for policies that promote age equity, both in our workplaces and in our communities.
So using our voices.
Absolutely. And we can also, put our money where our mouth is
Right.
and support organizations that are creating opportunities and breaking down those barriers.
To LOCUM integration.
Exactly.
Okay, so to wrap things up, I have a question for you, our listener. Knowing what we've discussed about age discrimination, how common it is, and how sneaky it can be, what can you do to challenge it? What can you do in your own sphere of influence to create a more inclusive world?
It's a question worth thinking about. Remember, change starts with each of us.
Age is just a number. It's the talent and experience that matters, no matter how old you are. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of age discrimination. We hope you found it insightful and useful.